Good afternoon. My name is Ray Uttenhove, and I have the privilege of serving as the chair of the Women's Philanthropy Network. Welcome. We are so happy that you can join us today to celebrate 50 years of Title IX. We have a fascinating panel that is going to discuss how far we've come, and then we're going to take a look at the future. But before we do that, I want to invite you to participate in WPN's first Mother's Day tribute. Make a gift, make a contribution to WPN in honor of a mother or a special woman in your life, and we will send out a video recorded by a student celebrating the life and accomplishments of the person you're recognizing. What could be a better way to make Mother's Day really special? Next week, you will receive in your emails all the instructions and details about how to do that. So I hope that you will remember that this is a very unique way to express your love and appreciation for the women that are so important in your life, and then to also support the innovative work that WPN's doing, and which in turn means that you're supporting the students at Georgia State. So I'm going to thank you in advance for your contribution and your gift. So now let's get to our program. It's my honor to introduce our moderator, Kathy Henson, someone that many of you know from our former programs. I'll still tell you just a little bit about her. She is a graduate of the Georgia State University Law School. She's a founder of WPN, and most importantly, she chairs our education committee. So Kathy, thank you so much for your leadership, and I'm going to turn it to you.
Thank you, Ray. And I'd like to welcome our audience to our kickoff educational event for 2022, this webinar on the topic of Title IX, which celebrates its 50th anniversary in 2022. We will be following up this webinar with an actual in-person event on June the 23rd, which is the actual 50th anniversary of the signing of Title IX. I'd like to introduce our panelists today. We are very fortunate to welcome three members of the faculty and administration here at Georgia State who play a role in the Title IX compliance or education of students, faculty, and staff here at Georgia State. Let me start by introducing Dean Sarah Cook. Dean Cook was recently named the Dean of the Honors College here at Georgia State, although she had been serving as interim dean since 2020 and part of the Honors College since 2012. Dean Cook has been a member of the faculty here at Georgia State since 1997 in the Department of Psychology. She did her undergraduate degree at St. Mary's College in Indiana and her doctorate at the University of Virginia, and is a well-regarded and well-known expert in the field of violence against women. So we are very lucky to have Dean Cook participate with us today. And Dean Cook, I'd like to ask you to just give us a brief description of what you do at Georgia State, what you have done, what you will do, and how it may have been impacted by Title IX.
Thank you, Kathy. It's an honor to serve on the panel today. I am now leading the Honors College and interacting primarily with undergraduate students and faculty in a very different way than I did as a departmental member in psychology. I am no longer actively doing my own research, but instead helping others find paths to their own research. I had a very satisfying and productive career in violence against women, which ironically sunsetted as all the Title IX issues came about. So that was really interesting to write about. I would say that probably I'm here because of Title IX. I'm one of the women who grew up with Title IX in her life. And I'm certain that it opened doors that otherwise may not have been open for me.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We look forward to hearing from you further on this panel. Our next panelist is Dean Jaray Mazique. She's the Assistant Dean of Students here at Georgia State. She also got her doctorate in education from Georgia State University. She has a degree in English and secondary education, and most recently chaired the Title IX subcommittee for the Georgia State University Diversity and Inclusion Working Group. So, Dr. Mazeek, thank you so much for joining us today. You bring an interesting and current perspective, and I'd love to know what your life looks like on a daily basis here at Georgia State.
Thank you so much. I am really honored to be here as well. And I'm glad you added on at my daily life at Georgia State, because my daily life is really chaotic. I must say that I'm honored to be here. Title IX is one of those areas I've been really passionate about over the years. And I would say it started around 2011 after the Dear Colleague letter. And we were looking at hiring someone who would really focus on Title IX initiatives, investigation, prevention, all of that stuff. And so I'm lucky, I would say lucky to be able to, and honored to be able to serve in that capacity. It's been a journey, and I'm sure we'll talk about it today, just where Title IX started, where it is now, how it started, where it is now, and the implications. But I agree with Dr. Cook. I definitely believe that many of us, although not based on our skill set, but just structurally, wouldn't be here without this legislation. So I'm excited to continue the work.
Thank you. And I must say we are very fortunate that our webinar today is March 30th, because Dean Mazique has just recently announced that she is leaving Georgia State University for a new opportunity at Spelman College as Director of Title IX Compliance. So congratulations, and thank you so much for deferring that start date to April 1st.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our third panelist is Georgia State's own Kelcey Roegiers, who is the Senior Associate Athletic Director and Chief Diversity Officer here at Georgia State. And I say Georgia State's own because Kelcey has earned her bachelor's degree and her master's degree from Georgia State University and has now been employed for over a decade at Georgia State. And during her undergraduate years, she was a stellar women's basketball player for her 4 years and has set many records that stand to this day. So, Kelcey, thank you so much for joining us. You have such a unique perspective on Title IX as it relates to being a student athlete and now being an athletic director and compliance officer in this area. So thank you. I know you juggle so many balls that your typical day changes every day, but give us a flavor of what it's like.
Sure, and thanks for having me. I'm humbled to be on this panel. You're right, it's very different every day, but I think it's two-pronged for me. One is education for our coaches and for our student athletes of what Title IX is, and the equality space, but also the sexual misconduct space. And then for our student athletes and for our administrations to make sure the equality piece is really there from a budgetary standpoint, from providing resources of academic advisors, full-time staff, and just making sure the checks and balances are there on a daily basis.
Thank you. Thank you all. So let's start our discussion with looking at the actual language of Title IX. And Dean Mazique will help us figure out what it was intended to do and how it started. So we have a slide that actually shows the language of Title IX. And for those of you who are not immersed in Title IX, it's actually Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. And people ask, well, amendments to what? It was amendments to the Higher Education Act of 1965. So the original legislation that grew Title IX started in 1965, and it says simply, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program receiving federal financial assistance. So Jaray, that's where we started, and there's an awful lot to unpack there. So give us kind of a foundational context of how this came about and what it was intended to do.
Sure. Thank you again. So let's start in 1972. We identify that that's not really a long time, a long time ago, 1972, 50 years. Many of us, probably even on here, I don't know how old anyone is, but, we definitely may have been around before or certainly shortly after. And identifying that it's not that long ago, but in a way, when we're still dealing with some of the things we have to navigate right now, it's long enough to not have to do that. But again, it's one of those issues, those topics that is just continuous and it shifts based on the political landscape. But when we think about it, 1972 was authored by Patsy Mink, right? And it was signed by President Nixon. And all three branches actually touched Title IX as it was going through the process. They were trying to identify that women were being excluded from higher education and that discrimination was occurring. So when you see the language from the prior screen talking about sex discrimination, its focus primarily at the time was discriminating against admissions, women in admissions. And then you started to see some of the case law really talk about not just admissions, but exclusion from sports. And then, of course, later on, you start to see a really pivotal case, which is the Grove City case. And that case is really interesting because that was in 1984, because a lot of times people think, well, if you receive federal funding, or maybe you're not a state institution, but if you receive federal funding, even as a private school, Title IX applied to you. I think one of the biggest pieces that we start to see right now is the case where you start to focus on the Alexander versus Yale in 1980, where there's the first time they actually used Title IX in that sexual harassment against an institution. And that's huge when we think about that. But going back to 1979, that's where we have the Cannon versus the University of Chicago. And that's where that admission denial based on sex kicked in. So there's a lot of cases. I would always say follow case law, and that will certainly guide you on where we are with Title IX, where we've been, and even where we're going. Right now, when we think of Title IX, people still think of athletics, and Kelcey will definitely talk about that. But they will definitely think of sexual assault, sexual harassment as it relates to sex discrimination. And as you know, with the changes, we'll talk about that hopefully today, but they're really going to expand that into other areas as well. So I'm really intrigued to see what happens next. We probably will identify at some point the reauthorization, the VAWA reauthorization, which has come down and really given us guidance on how we need to have these climate surveys. And so we're all working on, that coming through and what universities have to do as a result of that. And then, of course, we're all waiting for the new guidance or law to come regarding the changes in the Department of Education under Biden's administration as well.
Thank you, Jaray. Yes, I think your point about it was originally intended to get at the problem of women being excluded from some universities and colleges altogether, and then certain majors in particular. And so it used to be that some women could not get into programs that were exclusively for men, such as architecture. Or there were limited slots for women where they could get into the program, but they couldn't comprise more than, let's say, 20% of the slots. And I was reading an article that talked about, so not only were the slots limited, but the criteria were higher, that women were held to a much higher standard and had to have SAT scores that were 30 or 40 points higher than men. So you had exclusion on many levels altogether in certain programs and then in limited acceptance. And I hadn't realized before I started reading some of the articles in preparation for this webinar that many of the programs that women were excluded from were also the higher paying careers. Mm. So when you exclude women from medicine, law, architecture, engineering, you're also excluding them from being able to access a labor market at a higher pay. And, back in 1972 or prior to 1972, women were disproportionately making up majors in the lowest paying professions. And of course, teaching comes to mind. Mm-hmm. And they were excluded from the higher paying professions. But the good news, I suppose, is that if we look at law, for example, prior to 1972, women made up fewer than 10% of graduates from law school, and now they're more than 50%. So they are graduating in higher numbers and in parity, maybe not getting those leadership positions once they enter the career path. But where we see women lacking are still in the STEM fields. Women are still only making up 20 to 25% of the students in engineering, math, technology, those kinds of majors. Is that what you see?
Yes, and correction, Alexander versus Yale was 2008. So just want to make sure if anyone researches that, they have the correct date. And I'm hoping that Dr. Cook can talk a little bit more about the STEM area as well, because there's researchers are actually looking at the implications of sex discrimination in the STEM fields, particularly with graduate assistants. And so they have grants right now that's assisting with this research. But yes, it's still an issue. It's still a concern. And even when they are allowing certain women to enter into that area, there's the discrimination that still occurs when they're in that space, particularly if they're a GA, a GTA, GRA. And so it's really important to identify not only should we focus on the issue that some are not getting in, is when they get in, there's also discrimination occurring in those spaces as well.
Absolutely. Well, let me bring in Kelcey, because Kelcey, for somehow, athletics has become synonymous with Title IX, even though it wasn't the original intention of Title IX. My understanding is that the law was passed, and then it took them 3 or 4 years to issue regulations. And so it wasn't until about 1975, 1976, when somebody happened to focus on the fact that Title IX was going to apply to athletics, that some people started paying attention. And yes, it does apply to athletics. And I just want to show a slide that shows the progress that we've made in women in sports. And the top graph is women or girls who are in participation in the high school athletics. And the bottom graph is women who are participating in college athletics. And Kelcey, I'd love your viewpoint on kind of the early jump in participation and certainly closing the gap, but now it looks like it's leveling off a little bit. So can you tell us about, participation, what you're seeing? Should we be concerned about this, or is this great progress?
Yeah, I do think we're closing the gap. And, that is partly what Title IX was in place to do from an athletics standpoint, in a lot of various ways, not just participation, but salaries, broadcasting opportunities, and we'll go into that a little bit later. But if you're taking a quick look at that graph, and if you can't really see, some numbers that I want you to pay attention to is the high school girls' participation in 1971 was roughly around 400,000. And in 2018, when this study was done, we were at roughly 3.5 million. And then for college, you were roughly at 25,000. And in 2017, we were roughly at 225,000 for collegiate female athletes. So, and then you see the gap is being closed by the men too. And I think one of the myths, and, hopefully this isn't a question, but if it is later on, we can expand into it. But, that's been a myth for so long in Title IX with athletics, is that the more opportunities we give for women, the less opportunities there are for males. And as you can clearly see through these data points, that's not the case. The more opportunities for women, the more opportunities for men as well.
Exactly. And it's my understanding that, that this applies to male opportunity too, is that it's not solely about female opportunities, that there has to be, and we'll go in later what the different ways of evaluating, equity are, but men can use Title IX to argue that they're not getting a fair shake too. Isn't that correct?
That's absolutely correct. A lot of programs during COVID, if you go back, a lot of universities were shutting down men's programs, right? And so there was a lot of lawsuits that came out to that. I think in 2006, Rutgers shut down a program, and their operating budget was roughly around 175,000. Us as administrators, and I think we're getting better, Kathy, at not making this the scapegoat, is we like to blame Title IX on budgetary issues, when in reality, in that 2006 model that I just explained, football alone paid $175,000 on hotels alone. So instead of reallocating money, which men's basketball and football, generally it's about 78% of your men's operating budgets, we need to stop making Title IX our scapegoat and really look at our budget and say, how can we reallocate to make sure these men's opportunities aren't being diminished?
And when we talk about participation in sports, Kelcey, what are the popular ones? And we can start with, what does Georgia State offer in terms of women's sports? And does that reflect kind of the popularity of those sports in K-12?
Sure. So, a lot of research is done in that area. And Kathy, if I can go into kind of this three-pronged test that usually athletics uses, right? Usually they talk about proportionality. So athletics versus your general student body and the underrepresented sex there. And then it continued program expansion. And that doesn't always mean adding another sport, but opportunities for more full-time staff, for cost of attendance, different things like that. And then the last piece, kind of what you just hit on, is that full accommodation, right? And so interest, ability, and regionality are the three things that they look at. And there's some guidance on that, but is there a true interest? And that's gray, right? Is there true ability to compete at that level, whether it's Division III, II, or I, JUCO, NAIA? And then that regionality, right? Can I travel within a decent or reasonable proximity to compete with teams that have that like sport? So, if you want to take kind of ice hockey, for an example, we're in the South, there's not a lot of teams in the South. And so if we had a bunch of general student body come and show the true interest and the true ability, we still have to meet that regionality component. And so a lot of universities hit prong 3 because they don't have all three of those things, which is needed for Title IX.
Excellent. I look forward to your participation, Kelcey. This area of the law is so incredibly interesting and organic and all over the news right now. Sarah Cook, let me bring you in and have you talk a little bit about when sexual harassment became covered by Title IX. Not that it traditionally hadn't been, but there was very little focus on it until a certain point, and then it became kind of front and center in the Title IX debate. So talk to us about that, how that came about.
Kathy, it has always been a part of Title IX, at least as far back as 1997, if not further. But in 2011, it got a lot of exposure and a lot of attention. And that is mainly because the Obama administration, the Office of Civil Rights and the Department of Education issued what's called a Dear Colleague letter. And a Dear Colleague letter is something that a federal agency sends out to their colleagues indicating that the agency and the people they're writing to have a shared interest in solving a problem or addressing a problem. This Dear Colleague letter gave the most specific guidelines to universities and colleges on how to address sexual assault within the guidelines that had been produced previously. I'll just stop right there, previously. So language about sexual harassment has been very prevalent in all communications from the Office of Civil Rights to universities and colleges. Language around sexual assault has always been present in all these communications and multiple communications, but often euphemisms were used. But in footnotes and examples, were often about sexual violence, or about sexual assault and rape. But what institutions should do specifically, so for example, having someone like Jaray at an institution, that was really not addressed as adequately as it needed to be until those 2011, until that guideline, the guideline in the Dear Colleague letter. Now that doesn't have the force of law, and I think what we may see in whenever we do see the new regulations that come out, there may be some changes, and some things may be codified in law, and other things may go back to be set in regulations as opposed to a Dear Colleague letter. So there are going to be lots of changes based on all of the attention that the Dear Colleague letter got in 2011.
And so, Sarah, my understanding is that the tension in this area is around, number one, the burden of proof that is required at one of these, and I don't know whether you call it an adjudication, a hearing, whatever, and then the free speech implications. So just kind of in a nutshell, tell us the burden of proof issue.
So the burden of proof traditionally has been what it has been for other areas of student misconduct, which is, I believe, a preponderance of evidence. And I'll depend on Jaray, who's the expert in this area. And many people misunderstood the 2011 guidance as increasing that burden, or decreasing that burden of proof. And that was not true. It's always been the preponderance of evidence, just like misconduct for academic dishonesty or anything else. One thing I'd like to say is, when you asked us about how Title IX has had an impact on us, one thing that I would say is, when I was in college and in early graduate school, universities were still grappling with who's going to handle rape and sexual assault on college campuses. It was a hot potato. Should it be the local county sheriff or the city, prosecutor, or should it be the university? Should it be both? And if it is, who goes first, etc. And I think some of the progress that we've made now is that it's clear that universities have a mandate. They must address this issue. Now, victims can still choose other avenues to pursue, and indeed, local jurisdictions may pursue other avenues, but it's clear now that universities must handle it. And I think that piece of history is often less understood. Can you say a little bit more what you mean by freedom of speech?
Yeah, like the ACLU and university professors came out and said, it's kind of hard to define sexual harassment when it's based on words. And so you're kind of running into a free speech issue there. It's just one of the two, when you Google, particularly what's going to happen with the 2020 regs. Those are the two predominant issues. And it's always, whenever it's a speech violation. That's always kind of the hard part of it, is trying to define what is or what is not harassment.
Right. I'm sorry. Yes. That's a very good question. And the guidance is, I think, pretty clear that any kind of harassment that is speech or gesture based, or graphic depictions, or anything that would fall under what we traditionally think about as a hostile climate, has to be a prevalent feature and has to be a pattern of behavior that creates a climate that is counterproductive to education. So when you hear someone say, oh, you can't say and someone looks nice, or oh, you can't even say, well, yes, you can still give someone a genuine compliment, but it'd be smart to think about what you're complimenting on, and is that consistent with what is expected in that setting. But there is no list of things you can say and things you can't say. This is not a one-off kind of misbehavior. There has to be a pattern. It has to establish a hostile climate toward education. And in my own experience, it's not just about, say, a particular person in a class. So, for example, I've had the experience where an entire class has come to me and said, a professor is not behaving in an appropriate manner towards this student. So it didn't, this was a case where it didn't only affect the woman who was being targeted, but it made the other students uncomfortable as well. And yes, you can be assured Georgia State handled that in a very good way. But, a hostile climate does not only have an impact on an individual student, but others in the classroom, or if that's an educational setting, like a field, field work, that's part of it too. I mean, something that Jaray mentioned about graduate students. Thank you, Jaray. Just put the exact language up, which is unwelcome verbal, nonverbal, or physical conduct based on sex determined by a reasonable person, which is an advance. It used to be woman. That's so severe and pervasive and objectively offensive that it denies a person access to participate in class. So, for an example, this young woman didn't want to go to class, and others didn't want to go to class either because it was such an uncomfortable experience.
Thank you, Sarah. Let's bring everybody back in. And just to follow up on Sarah's last point about the pervasiveness of this, we're talking about Title IX in the context of higher education. But I remember when I was chairing the State Board of Education back in, I guess it was 1999, there was a Supreme Court case that ruled on a Georgia Board of Education, Monroe County, that Title IX, this sexual harassment, applied to K-12 also. And it was always intended to apply to K-12. But that hadn't been at the forefront. Really, I think higher education was always at the forefront of Title IX. Are any of you familiar with the Davis versus Monroe case? It was a little fifth grade girl who was harassed and molested and manhandled by a classmate. And her mother kept going to the teacher and the principal in the school saying, you've got to do something about this. After, 6 or 8 months of this, the little girl didn't want to go to school anymore. She was suicidal. And, the Board of Education was basically not our problem. And it worked its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, it is your problem. So do any of you have, any perspective on the K-12 sphere? Because I would guess sexual harassment is very different in K-12, particularly for a fifth grader, than it might be in a college setting.
Yes, I can jump right in and talk about some of my research. I actually focused on K-12 in my dissertation research. And what I've realized is that it is an area that's not talked about often. The focus always tends to be on higher education. And so when I started to do my research and focus on what does that look like? What's the sex education in K-12? So when students come to us, they're a little bit more prepared to navigate that, but it's almost non-existent. And what I found in my research is not only is it not addressed appropriately always, they don't even categorize it as sexual assault. Many of these cases are defined under or categorized under bullying. So the numbers are very off when you look at the data around it. So you'll see a lower number of sexual assault cases happening because they are including or titling it or categorizing it as bullying for some of these and not appropriately responding to it. And so we find that it's pretty problematic. I think oftentimes K-12 has to navigate so many other standards and requirements. And so with them, it's like how we don't have the appropriate people or appropriate staff to even navigate this. And so we have to identify that it is an issue. It's a concern, and I think if the focus is on not just higher education, but put the emphasis on K through 16, then we will probably be in a better space to start highlighting some of the things that's happening in that K-12 area.
Yeah, I remember when that case first came out, and it required willful disregard on the part of the administrators. They knew about it and did nothing. One of the initial reactions was, well, we just won't have any person to report to. It was like, hear no evil, see no evil. If there's nobody to report to, then there can't be a violation. I'm hoping we've come a long way from those days. But that was a lot of some of the initial reaction to compliance with Title IX. And so, Kelcey, let me ask you, you do a lot of oversight of Title IX. Do you do also the athletic piece and the student conduct piece, or does that fall under the Dean of Students?
So we work really closely with the Dean of Students and kind of collaborate on presentations and education. And so it's twofold on that as well. And so making sure the proper education is there for our student athletes. But then, like I said, again, for staff as well, because we have staff on staff, coach on coach situations as well when it comes to sexual misconduct. And so we work very closely with the Dean of Students.
That's a good point. It's students on students, faculty or coaches and students. Is it faculty and faculty? Is that Title IX or is that Title VII? Is that employment or Title IX?
That still falls under Title IX. You can still, some of it will still fall under Title VII as well, but Title IX does apply to faculty and staff as well. And every institution is required to have a Title IX coordinator. So Kelcey's being humble, but she is a deputy Title IX coordinator as well. So no matter what the situation, whether it's students, faculty, or staff, we have an actual Title IX coordinator, Kieran Morrow at Georgia State University, and she kind of oversees the whole Title IX area. But there's a deputy Title IX coordinator for athletics, which is Kelcey, and then there's one in the student area, which is Lynette Brown, who's an associate dean of students. But if there's any violation, they'll go through the Title IX area, so for consistency and fairness.
And Jaray, do you oversee these investigations of complaints? Is that what the process looks like?
Not anymore. I've done that. I did that for about 6 years, and probably after year one, I realized we needed to do more under prevention. And so after 6 years, they moved me over to the prevention work. And that has been very rewarding because we have a system in place to actually respond. But really my focus and my passion is on how do we prevent it from happening. So I no longer investigate.
But you did for a number of years, that was part of your job?
Yes.
And my understanding is that's where, emanating from the 2011 guidance, the focus was moved to, instead of kind of investigation of cases, to prevention and creating a more accepting climate around this issue. Is that right?
Absolutely. And so you'll look at the reauthorization of VAWA, which is the Violence Against Women's Act and Women Act. And it's really important because, as I mentioned earlier, we have a new reauthorization that was thrown into this omnibus bill, and there's lots to do with it. And we're going to pull Sarah back in for sure. She's trying to run away from us, but we were going to hold on with two hands because there's so much work to do when we think about climate and the climate surveys that are going to be mandated, and how does that work, and how do people comply, and what are the resources available to even help institutions be in compliance with federal legislation, and the resources. Everyone does not have the same resources on their campuses, so that's really important. But yes, it continues to include the preventive work, really getting a sense of the environment on your campus and how you can enhance it to make it a better, much more conducive space for safety and growth and learning.
So Sarah, in your tenure at Georgia State in this space, what progress have you seen?
Oh, tremendous progress. I the best way I can describe it is, if I used to go to a cocktail party and someone would say, "Oh, and what do you research?" And I would say, "Violence against women, mostly rape." And that was the last piece of that conversation. And after 2011, when I said that, I suddenly became the focus of the cocktail party. Many, many questions. I remember the day that President Obama uttered the word rape on national television. I was in shock. The sea change in terms of what people are willing to discuss and debate. And I don't care. I love the debates. It's fantastic, the amount of dialogue there is now about this question. And so we have finally moved that. We've rolled the rock away from the problem, and now we're at least willing to talk about the problem. And that's got to happen first, and that has finally happened. We thought there would be a very small window of opportunity that we would have to act, but that hasn't been the case, and which is very exciting. Now, Jaray may know something I don't know about the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, but she did mention something that's really important, and that is when the Obama White House issued its task force report on keeping students safe from sexual assault. They suggested that schools conduct campus climate surveys. Now, universities and institutions have conducted campus climate surveys around many, many different issues in the past, but never about sexual assault and rape, et cetera. And, a cottage industry really sprung up. But with Jaray and others at Georgia State and colleagues around the country, we were able to pull together a group that we called the Administrator Researcher Campus Climate Consortium, and built a really state-of-the-art survey that we offered free of charge with all the support you could imagine to institutions, because we knew that a place like Georgia State would probably have the resources to do a survey that would be sufficient. But many, many smaller schools would not be able to. And, within a year and a half, we had something like well over 400 or 500 requests for the survey and, requests for help. So that's the other part that I see is really promising, and then I'll be quiet, is that there is a very proactive reach on behalf of institutions to begin to address this, even before it was mandated. So I think
one of your comments that concerns me, Sarah, is you saying that it wasn't that long ago where people wouldn't use the word rape, and we're living in a political climate where state legislatures are trying to shut down the topics that can be discussed or taught particularly in K-12 education, not necessarily higher ed because students are over the age of 18. But my concern would be that, if we want to start teaching young people early about what is acceptable and not acceptable behavior, you have to start discussing some of these terms at an early age. And I hadn't thought about that till you said it, that really is a chilling effect on kind of educating younger people about acceptable behavior.
You're absolutely right, Kathy. I just co-authored a chapter looking at the parallels of comprehensive sex education and principles for sexual assault prevention. And they have to coexist. They have to merge. And these conversations have to begin when children are at a very young age. I'm not talking about rape with children, but about body integrity and safety and limits and knowing when to stop. I have 2 boys. They would wrestle, and I would say, you can wrestle all day long, but the minute someone says stop or I don't want to do this, you just have to stop. And I was so gratified one day to hear one of them yelling, I said stop, and Mom said, when someone says stop, you have to stop. And I thought, oh, victory is close, but that's not a conversation that everybody's willing to have. We have to get to that place.
Well, I'm glad you're seeing progress, though. That is a very positive development. And speaking of positive developments, Kelcey, I want to talk to you a minute because March Madness is what everybody's talking about and watching. And I have been so pleased and gratified to see such coverage of the women's games. And I understand that was incited by what happened last year at March Madness. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Sedona Price from Oregon last year. You talk about bravery. She embodies bravery. She recorded on her phone some inequities of the food that they were provided versus the men, the gifts, the weight room that they were provided. And there was true comparisons, and, the conversation started, that dialogue. And so the NCAA had a third party come in and do gaps between the men's and women's game. Since last year, 50 of those 65 have been closed. Some of the main ones being that the branding March Madness, the women can actually use. Many people didn't know that the women couldn't use March Madness. And so that, along with full-time staff, player lounges, the gifts, the food, the weight room, officials pay. A lot of people forget about the officials, but I am one myself too. So that's nice. And signage, right? In the airports, on the streets, the publicity. And then, like you said, the viewership and the broadcasting rights as well. And so what a brave, brave soul. At that point, it allowed many coaches to speak up. I think so many people are fearful to speak up when it comes to Title IX and inequalities, that they're fearful of their jobs or the repercussions or the backlash. But it has opened a door for coaches, current sitting coaches and coaches that have since retired, to really talk about the inequalities between the men's and the women's game. But I'm happy to say that 50 of those 65, those gaps have been closed, but we still have a long way to go.
And for those of you who didn't see the video, she showed a picture of the men's fully equipped weight room, and then the little pyramid stand that had 6 little hand weights on it that embodied the women's weight room, and just posted it to social media, and it took off, and it instigated a thorough evaluation called the Kaplan study that came out and pointed out all these inequities. And I just am so pleased to see the difference in real time watching March Madness. Even the ads, I think it's Buick who does an ad about women make up 40% of the athletes, but only 10% of the media attention. So there's a real eye-opening to the treatment of women in sports. And another related issue, Kelcey, that you can talk to us about is I just read this morning in the Washington Post that now that college athletes are allowed to make money from name, image, and likeness, and you can talk about that, the number 2 sport making money is women's basketball. First are football players, and 2 are women basketball players because they're so conversant in social media. So can you tell us about what opportunities that opens up?
Sure. So I think when name, image, and likeness came out, a lot of people were fearful of Title IX and the opportunities that the men's sports, in addition to those premier positions, your quarterback, your point guard on your men's basketball team, your running back, that they were going to get more opportunities than women. And we just really haven't seen that. It does take a lot of work to put, in it. We give educational platforms. The state of Georgia mandates that you have 5 hours of financial literacy to go along with that as well, which I think is phenomenal. So yeah, Kathy, I think people were very fearful, and we have seen a little bit of what that we think is pay for play. There's no doubt about that, even though they call it NIL. But yeah, there's tons of women out there, women's basketball, golf, gymnasts, that are now able to capitalize off of their name, image, and likeness. The young lady who was in the Olympics, who is a gymnast at Auburn, UCLA gymnast. There's twins that were at UCLA for women's basketball, that have a huge billboard in the city. And so, yeah, there are plenty of opportunities out there. How good your kind of circle and network is to help you with those opportunities. But, to this point of this generation, social media, right, is such a huge piece in publicizing good, positive images, and then also the negative and some of the untrue things. And so we have to be very careful of that. But social media, to Sedona Price's credit, really helped start this conversation. And it was a movement that we continue to have to help create change.
And some of the other related progress, I would imagine, due to Title IX is in the professional world, where women's soccer just won a victory in terms of equal pay. And the WNBA is getting compensated. I saw something that said, the highest salary in the WNBA was like $220,000 compared to, what men are making. And we can't solve all those problems, but what are you seeing in terms of opportunities for women after they complete their athletic career in college now?
Sure. The soccer, 22 million to 61 players certainly was a huge needle mover. The WNBA, also 3 times the salary limits that they were making, in addition to giving $5,000 stipends for childcare, also getting their own hotel rooms. They used to share hotel rooms, and then the premium seatings. I mean, these women are 6'6", 6'4". And so they were back there in the coach section when our men's teams, they charter everywhere. And so some of those movements have definitely happened, and it is encouraging for women who want to continue playing sports after college. You have a very small window where your body allows you to just be at the peak of performance. And so to be able to capitalize off of that is tremendous. Again, we still have a long way to go, especially in the WNBA, even though some of those things were changed. But you see the Brittany Griner situation, and take the legal side of it out of that. She was in Russia to make money because the WNBA doesn't pay her enough. And so, those opportunities for those salaries to be higher, the NBA guys don't have to go play in Russia or Turkey. They have a salary that's sufficient to support their families. So again, progress is good. I like it. Sometimes it's a little slower than I want, or that we all want. But there's more opportunities now for women to play after college and make a salary that's sufficient for them to live off of.
What is it about those countries, Kelcey, that value women's basketball enough to pay them that kind of money?
That's a really good question. I played in Sweden, which is more of a soccer, or they call it football over there. And so I think it really just depends on the country and how they embrace that sport. You could probably make arguments for different countries for different sports. So the price tag goes up, the hotter commodity you are.
Well, let's wrap up here and talk about, we see how far we've come, and we have. And I'll just ask you, so what would you like to see next? Kelcey, since you're on, what would you like to see next? One thing.
Wow, you put me on the spot here. It can't be one thing specific. I think growth in general for me, whether that's in the athletics realm, whether that's in the academics realm, whether it's pay gaps in general, I think for me, just continuing to move the needle in whatever field to close the gap between men and women is what I would continue to see.
And Dean Cook, what about you? What would you like to see?
Kelcey, I was saying it is a tough choice. I don't know. I'd really like to see comprehensive sexual education include issues about sexual assault and rape, and I guess I really think that until women have full equality in all arenas, rape and sexual assault, sexual harassment will continue.
Mm-hmm.
And
Dean Mazique, what about you?
I agree. I think that we need to focus on a comprehensive sex education in K-12 and just let it go right into post-secondary education. We really need to focus on the impact of this behavior and take out the politics and how people respond to this legislation and really identify the impact of these behaviors on our population.
I was wondering, the past few years, we've done a lot of virtual and online learning. Did the nature of Title IX compliance or violations change in an online environment?
And yeah, I saw that someone actually asked that from the website too. And we saw the numbers decrease a little bit initially during the pandemic, but we saw an increase in intimate partner violence because most people were forced to be in a space with someone who may have been assaulting them. So, but as far as the overall cases, we saw a slight decrease because less people lived in the same environments on campus and people weren't around each other as much, but there were more cases of harassment, virtual harassment. And so our response continued to be the same. We just moved our processes to the remote platform and still conducted investigations and hearings in that virtual platform.
Okay, well, thank you all for a wonderful conversation, providing a great foundation for WPN to move on to the next step of, other issues. Beginning with our event on June 23rd. You're all invited. It's an in-person event around the topic of STEM education. One of the areas we didn't talk about today is what are the barriers to women entering the STEM fields? It has to do with cultural expectations. It has to do with the culture of those fields. It has to do with access into those programs. And we have a panel of women who are in STEM fields who will talk about what their barriers to entry were, how to be successful in those fields, what we can do to encourage women to go into those fields beginning at a very early age, and what the sexual harassment online environment or even corporate environments can be in tech fields for women that we need to do a better job of educating our young people about to make sure that women continue to have access and opportunity in all aspects of education. So I want to thank you for participating today. This webinar will be on the WPN website. And if you have any questions that you think we can answer, please email us at contactwpn@gsu.edu. And thank you for participating today.